We now get reaction from the SACP's Dr. Alex Mashilo on the parole granted to the killer of the once popular and charismatic former leader of the party. Dr. Alex, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. What we are hearing, particularly from the SACP, is that when you listen to the presentation of Chief Justice Raymond Zondo today, is as if there were only two parties to this, the Minister of Justice and the assassin. Much of what you had put in for consideration was not taken in how this judgment was reached. This is what the judge says. The SACP and Mrs. Hani jointly opposed this application. They submitted that the application is without merit, should thus fail, as it would not be in the interest of justice to grant leave to appeal. They argue that the crime committed by the applicant was a crime unlikely any other in South Africa, in that it shook the very core which South Africa was trying to build at the time, a democratic and free society. Its motive was to throw South Africa into a monumental political catastrophe. And then the judge goes on to say, well, we've got to reach a point as the Constitutional Court to decide how much is the seriousness of the crime going to continue to be considered in terms of the refusal of parole. What is the SACP's position on that?
Thank you very much, Tabu. You know, the words you have quoted from the judgment do not constitute the totality of the submission made by the SACP and the Chris Hani family. In fact, the judgment opens with that, acknowledging that the assassination of Chris Hani, the husband, the wife, the uncle, you name it, in the family and the relatives. The General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, a member of the National Executive Committee and National Working Committee of the ANC, was also an attempt to assassinate the transition from the apartheid regime to the democratic dispensation that established the very constitutional code. And that this was actually calculated in plunging South Africa into civil war, and the constitutional code amended that and called it civil unrest. And in having said that, it then proceeded to say that had to be taken into account. And then they proceeded to say, but that was not the only side. Yeah. And thereafter, the entire judgment focused on what the convicted assassin has said and being critical about what the ministers of justice and correctional services have said. Yeah. And nothing whatsoever from the submission of the SACP and the Chris Hani family. By the way, in that submission of the SACP and Chris Hani family, there was a refutation of some of the claims that the convicted assassins made, that he apologized to the family and so on. Those claims were refuted. I must say, the judgment referred to a parole board hearing in which the SACP and the Hani family were represented. I was there on behalf of the South African Communist Party. And the danger that faces South Africa today is that you may have people who committed serious crimes following certain processes, not in good faith, but with pretensions in order to tick the boxes, so that when the time for parole comes, they qualify for parole. I can tell you, and you need to write this thing down, after this judgment, there will be a before and an after of South Africa. In other words, somebody can commit murder tonight or tomorrow, can rape, can assassinate, and so forth. From the first day they enter prison, knowing what they need to do in order to attract parole, they will behave accordingly. So that on the first day, when they become eligible for parole, they can be paroled. There is no more maximum sentence in South Africa if you are listening to that particular judgment and its implications on what will happen once a prisoner reaches the date on which they qualify for parole. This case, therefore, was not merely between the Chris Hani family and the SACP and the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services on the one hand, and the convicted assassin on the other. Yeah. It is a case that demonstrates that law is not only written in the acts passed in Parliament and the constitutions and policies, but law can also be written without consultation through the judgments, and they can prevail if we do not develop the law and our democracy further. The implications now, I can tell you, I don't want to give an example about our relatives whose member was shot brutally in the early morning of yesterday. Those people, if they are arrested, they can just behave as if they comply with the parole requirements from the first day they enter jail. I can tell you, on the first day they become eligible for consideration, they will produce those records. This is one thing that must worry South Africans. Under what conditions are we going to bring an end? A situation where the assassins, the murderers, the rapists appear as if they have greater and more rights than the victims. Because if you read that judgment, it is as if the Constitutional Court's text is saying Walus is not just a victim, but is the only victim. There is no reference whatsoever in the judgment to the Chris Hani family as the victims, to the people who fought for liberation, the formerly oppressed who fought for democracy in this country.
Dr. Alex Mashilo, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Alex Mashilo there speaks on behalf of the South African Communist Party.